Good morning, everyone. It's Lee Henson, President and Founder of Agile Dad, and it's time for today's episode of the Daily Stand Up. So, without any further ado, let's get started. It's Monday. What a beautiful way to begin a week. I got an email from one of my active subscribers. I appreciate that. And they were asking a question regarding scheduling sprints. And here's where they are. Now, in their company culture says that they try to do no meeting Fridays, which I totally have mad respect for. I think that's a good idea. I don't think you should do meetings on Fridays. If I can at all avoid doing meetings on Fridays, I do. So, with that being said, the question was, I want to implement 2 week sprints. I said, okay. They said some sprints end on a Thursday. Is there a rule of thumb that you should start the following sprint on Friday? Because they want to avoid having sprint planning meetings on a Friday. But if it must be done, it must be done. What should I do? Good question, right? So here's my take on this. This is a pretty simple question because we want to keep the meetings consistent. One of the things I learned from Ken Schwaber very early on is that the sprint planning is kind of like a heartbeat. It needs to be consistent. If you're doing 2 week sprints, which I think is admirable, then you need to have a sprint planning meeting every 2 weeks. You need to do that. Now, you can keep these meetings short in size. You can keep these meetings concise. You can make sure you stick to a good agenda. You can time box things. There's lots of tips and tricks you can do to make sure you keep it lean. However, I do agree with you conceptually that you probably shouldn't be having meetings on Fridays. So one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give to folks who come to my trainings is that you should always start and end sprints on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday because people generally aren't checked in on a Monday and are already checked out on a Friday. And it's not saying that every organization is that way, but it's just a good rule to live by. If you do your meetings on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, you usually end up in a better place. You get higher participation, better team morale, people rally around a cause. There's lots of good things that come from focusing your attention on your meetings on those 3 days. Now, as far as having a back-to-back, and I think this is where it gets interesting. I see a lot of people who talk about having back-to-back sprints, and there's been a lot of conversation about having a gap day in between or some gap time in between. And one of the things that I really strive for is that we are prepared enough when we go into a sprint planning meeting that there's no need to have a gap. Because I want to make sure when we walk into that meeting that we're familiar with work, that we know what's going on, and that we're following more of an XP pull method so that everybody pulls one thing they want to work on and we get started, right? And then we proceed through the items that are forecasted for that sprint. And as we finish them, each developer, each person building or working on a product or service can go and pull the next item off of said list. What this does is it keeps that initial meeting down really short. Now, I know some of you might be screaming, but what about, detailed questions or detailed things? Well, that's a reflection that you're not doing proper backlog refinement or backlog grooming. If you had a 1 hour meeting per week with the team to do the backlog grooming, it would keep this sprint planning meeting down very short. What's the other added benefit there? Well, then you could have your end of sprint review Thursday before lunch, and then have your sprint planning meeting Thursday after lunch, thereby eliminating the need for having a meeting on a Friday and by having both meetings just as you should and keeping that 2 week cadence. There you go. Another question that came out of this one, it said, our organizational planning now is held quarterly, and it's based on fiscal quarters, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, September, etc. How do we integrate those meetings? Well, the same way you'd integrate any other meeting. You need to schedule it, right? And you need to put it in. Now, I've had people ask me, do we put this into our product backlog or into our sprint backlog so we can account for the time? And the answer to this question, as it ties in, is that you should always have 2 separate tracking systems. One system that's used for tracking time or hours for people, how many days are they taking a vacation, are they at work, those kind of things. And a separate system for governing and managing what you're doing with regard to the agile work you're trying to perform. I never want those two to commingle. I don't want people to start estimating using time. And I definitely don't want people trying to take time off using story points. It just, the two are 2 totally separate things. And I think that if we treat it as such, it's going to make it a lot easier for us from a behavioral perspective to know what to do when. And it's going to make it easier for us to incorporate those meetings and say, we'll just reduce the velocity for this sprint because this week we have our quarterly planning session and we have our quarterly organizational meeting. And I think the other key here is that, you need to make sure you are having either a rapid release planning session or some type of quarterly PI planning or organizational planning or however often you need, so that you can schedule and function with releases in such a way that it makes sense, and so that it doesn't inhibit your ability to have the meetings that you need, but also so that it doesn't happen to fall on a Friday. Because I'm a big fan of no meeting Fridays. What can I say? I'm a big fan of as few meetings as possible to get the job done. But I believe that if we make our meetings more concise, but also more, I want to make sure I use the right word here. I want it to be more in depth. I want it to be more enriched. That was the word I was looking for. If you enrich your meetings and have the right information, the right people in the room, and have the right conversations, you can make your meetings concise and still have high value meetings. There we go. That's where I was going. I hope that was helpful, and I hope it answered your questions. If you have a question you want answered on the Daily Stand Up podcast, don't be afraid to send it to us. We do answer our emails, and we do take a look and take each of these topics seriously. So please submit your ideas over to learnmore@agiledad.com. We'd love to learn more about what you want to talk about so that we can make sure we're hitting the things that are important to you. So as always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.